The day Alma Sullivan rode into Harlan Creek, she had $37 sewn into the hem of her coat, a loaded derringer tucked inside her boot, and a name she was already practicing forgetting. The town of Harlan Creek, nestled in the high desert basin of southern Colorado in the autumn of 1878, was the kind of place that asked no questions of newcomers because most newcomers arrived precisely because they did not want to be asked. The main street was a crooked line of weathered storefronts, a saloon with a leaning porch railing, a dry goods store, a livery, and a small white church whose bell had cracked 2 winters prior and never been replaced. Dust moved through the streets in slow, deliberate swirls, and the mountains to the west turned purple at dusk with a kind of violent beauty that made you feel both small and forgiven. Alma pulled her roan mare to a stop outside the livery and sat there a moment, watching the town breathe. She was 26 years old, though she looked like she had been 26 for a very long time already. Her dark hair was pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, and her dress, though trail-worn, had once been a deep green that suited the gold of her eyes. She had a stillness about her that was not peace, but something harder, the stillness of a woman who had learned to stop flinching at loud sounds by sheer force of will. She dismounted, led the mare inside the livery, and arranged for a week's board with the stable hand, a boy of about 16 who kept stealing glances at her scarred left hand. She did not explain it. She paid in coin and asked where a woman might find honest work. The boy pointed her toward a woman named Gertrude Fowler, who ran the boarding house on the east end of town, and who had recently lost her cook to a traveling preacher's wife, who offered a larger wage and the promise of salvation. Alma found Gertrude Fowler to be a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain, not unfriendly, but testing everything they looked at. She looked at Alma for a long moment over the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a coffee mug. "You cook?" Gertrude asked. "I cook," Alma said. "I mean actually cook, not boil things and call it supper." "I make a beef stew that has made grown men weep," Alma said, without a trace of boasting, simply as a fact she had established through experience. Gertrude almost smiled. "You have references." "I have 2 good hands and a serious need for work," Alma said, and she laid both hands on the table, the scarred one and the unscarred one, side by side like a declaration. Gertrude looked at the hands. She did not ask about the scar. She stood up and said, "Supper is at 6, breakfast at 7. You get a room on the 2nd floor, 3 meals a day and $4 a week. If you steal from me or bring trouble into my house, I will personally escort you to the edge of town on the back of a mule." "That seems fair," Alma said, and so she had a place. The boarding house served a rotating cast of ranch hands, a traveling surveyor from back east, and 3 permanent residents who had been there so long they had their own chairs at the breakfast table. One of those chairs belonged to Homer Atkins. Alma first saw Homer Atkins on her 2nd morning in Harlan Creek. She was carrying a pot of coffee from the kitchen when he came through the front door, hat in hand, smelling of horses and cold morning air, his boots leaving small clods of reddish dirt on the entryway rug that Gertrude would quietly curse about later. He was a tall man, not in the exaggerated way of men who wanted you to notice their height, but in the natural way of someone who had simply grown that way and never given it much thought. He had wide shoulders and hands that looked like they had repaired fences and hauled timber and held the reins of difficult horses for many years. His hair was dark brown, going a little silver at the temples, and he had a jaw that held a few days of beard without looking careless. He was 32. He saw her and stopped, not in the theatrical way but in the way of someone who had been walking with purpose and then lost it just for a second. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "Coffee?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, and sat down at his usual chair, and that was that. He ate breakfast with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that food was fuel and morning time was not for conversation. He said thank you when she refilled his cup. He said thank you again when she set a plate of eggs and salt pork in front of him. He did not stare at her, which she noticed, because men usually stared. After he left, one of the permanent residents, a retired freighter named Cletus Hobb who wore the same vest every single day of his life, leaned across the table and said, "That there is Homer Atkins. Has the rafter A spread about 6 miles east of town. Best cattle man in the county if you ask anybody who knows cattle. Quiet fellow. Good neighbor. Don't owe money to anybody and don't carry a grudge, which makes him practically a saint in this part of the world." Alma absorbed this information and said nothing. In those first weeks, she learned Harlan Creek the way she had learned every other place she had stopped carefully, methodically, noting exits and allies and the particular rhythms of who went where and when. She learned that the saloon owner, a barrel-shaped man named Delbert Pike, ran a honest enough establishment for a saloon. She learned that the sheriff, a thin man named Aloysius Crane, was competent but stretched thin across too much territory. She learned that the nearest telegraph office was in Pueblo, 3 days' ride north, and that the railroad, which was slowly making its way across the territory, had not yet come close enough to change things. She cooked breakfast and supper 6 days a week. On Sundays, Gertrude cooked and Alma walked. She walked the edge of the town, the scrub-brush hills to the east, the creek bed to the south, and she always walked with her eyes moving, cataloging the landscape, always knowing where the horses were, always knowing the fastest way out of any given situation. Homer Atkins, she began to notice, was a man who moved through the world as if he had made peace with all of it. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice, at least not in the dining room. He greeted Gertrude by name every morning and asked after her knees, which troubled her in the cold. He left accurate coin on the table for any additional services with the precision of a man who understood that fairness was its own kind of courtesy. One evening in late October, a wind came down from the mountains that had real winter in it, sharp and unforgiving, and the boarding house filled with the smell of Alma's slow-cooked venison stew and fresh cornbread. And every man at that table was quieter than usual in the way that good food makes people quiet, drawing them inward into something private and comforting. Homer looked up from his bowl at one point, and she happened to be standing in the doorway to the kitchen, watching to see if anyone needed anything, and their eyes met across the room. He did not smile exactly, but something in his face shifted the way light shifts when a cloud moves. He gave her a small nod, the kind that meant more than a nod, and she looked away first. She told herself that was nothing. The trouble arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday in November, which was the kind of day that trouble preferred ordinary and unremarkable, so no one was watching for it. His name was Doyle Whitmore, and he rode in with 2 other men on horses that were too good for men who looked as rough as they did. He was 38, heavy through the chest, with small eyes the color of dried mud and a smile that never quite connected to those eyes. He wore a suit coat over his riding clothes, which was either an affectation or an attempt to appear like something he was not. Alma was sweeping the front porch of the boarding house when she heard the horses come down the main street. She looked up, as anyone would, and then Doyle Whitmore turned his face in her direction, and something inside her went absolutely cold and absolutely still at the same time, the way a rabbit goes still in the grass when it has heard the hawk. She did not run. Running would have been visible. Instead, she turned and walked inside with measured steps, set the broom against the wall, went to the kitchen, and stood at the back window with her hands flat on the counter and her breathing very controlled. He had not seen her. She was almost certain. But almost certain was not the same as certain, and she had been almost certain before and had been wrong in ways that still marked her. She went upstairs, retrieved the small derringer from her boot, checked that it was loaded, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she came back down and finished supper as if everything was exactly as it had always been. At supper that evening, the men at the table talked about the strangers in town. Cletus Hobb had been by the saloon and reported that the three men were asking questions about a woman traveling alone. Dark hair, green dress, roan mare. The table was quiet for a moment. Alma was in the kitchen doorway with a fresh pan of biscuits, and she watched Homer Atkins, who was listening to Cletus with his coffee cup held in both hands, and she saw the moment he registered what Cletus was describing. His eyes moved to hers. Not with drama, not with the performance of putting something together, just quietly, naturally, the way water finds the lowest ground. He looked at her, and she met his gaze, and she did not say anything, and neither did he. After supper, when the others had gone to the parlor or their rooms, Homer stayed at the table and Alma came back through to collect the dishes. She moved around the table slowly, stacking plates. "You need anything?" His voice was low. It was a question that held more than it said. "I need to finish clearing the table," she said. "Right," he said. He sat still for another moment. Then he said, "The feed store has a back room that locks. I rent it for storing equipment sometimes. No one would think to look there." She stopped with a stack of plates in her hands and looked at him across the table. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No," he said. "You don't know what they want." "No," he said again. "It might be complicated. Most things worth dealing with are," he said. He stood up from his chair, put on his hat, said good night to her in the same tone he used every night, and walked out the front door. She stood holding the plates and feeling something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular and dangerous sensation of not being entirely alone. She told herself that was nothing either. She did not move her things to the feed store, but she appreciated that there was a door that locked somewhere in this town that Homer Atkins would not block her from using. The three men stayed 3 days. She caught sight of Doyle Whitmore once from across the street, through the dry goods store window, while she was buying flour for Gertrude. He was standing outside the saloon with his 2 companions, looking up and down the street with those small mud-colored eyes, and she stayed absolutely motionless behind a barrel of dried beans until he turned away, and then she moved to the back of the store and waited until she heard the sound of horses leaving. The men rode out on the 4th morning. Harlan Creek breathed again. Homer said nothing about it. He came to breakfast, ate his eggs, said thank you, and went out to his ranch. She watched him ride out through the kitchen window, that easy, unhurried posture in the saddle, and she thought that she had never in her life met anyone who used silence the way he did, not as an absence, but as a kind of shelter. December came, and with it real cold, the kind that bit through walls and made the water bucket by the back door freeze solid by morning. The boarding house was warm with the heat of cooking and the wood stove in the parlor, and in the evenings, the permanent residents and any ranch hands who happened to be staying would gather there with a decorum that was almost genteel, given the roughness of the general landscape. It was during one of those evenings, when the wind was pressing itself against the windows and the lamp light made everything amber and close, that Homer brought out a battered book of poetry. Not with any announcement, just placed it on his knee and began to read quietly to himself. And Alma, who was mending one of Gertrude's curtains near the stove, found herself listening without meaning to. She recognized the poem. It was Keats. She had read Keats by the light of a candle in a room above a laundry in Kansas City 4 years ago, when she had been a different version of herself, a version that still had illusions about how things would go. "You read poetry," she said. He looked up. "My mother sent me a book before she passed," he said. "I read it when the quiet gets too loud." She understood that perfectly, the way quiet could have a particular pressure that made noise preferable, but she did not say so. Instead she said, "That's Keats." "Yes," he said, and looked at her in that way he had, open and unguarded. "You know him." "I know enough of him," she said. He held the book toward her across the distance between their chairs, and she leaned forward and looked at the page, and he held it steady so she could read. And they sat like that for a few minutes, not quite together and not quite apart, and Cletus Hobb fell asleep in his chair by the window and began to snore gently, and neither of them mentioned it. Over the weeks that followed, Alma began to learn Homer Atkins the way she had learned every other thing in her life. carefully, and without letting on that she was learning. He rode in from the ranch most evenings for supper, because the boarding house was better than what he could cook alone, and he was honest about that, telling Gertrude without embarrassment that he had built the finest cattle spread in the Eastern Valley, but could not make bread that was worth eating. He had a ranch hand named Toby Marsh who lived on the property full-time, a young man of about 20 who was good with horses and quiet in the same mode as Homer though without the depth. He had acquired the Rafter A through 7 years of hard work, following a time when he had come west from Tennessee with nothing but a horse and a willingness to do difficult things. He was not a man who bragged, which meant that Alma learned these facts from other people, from Gertrude and from Cletus, and from the conversations that swirled around him at the supper table, and Homer never corrected or embellished any of it, just ate his supper and passed the salt when asked. She noticed he watched out for people in this quiet, undramatic way. When old Cletus had a bad chest cold in December and could not get warm, Homer brought extra firewood from his own supply without anyone asking. When one of the traveling ranch hands got his wages stolen at the saloon, Homer spoke to Delbert Pike on his behalf in a tone that did not threaten but communicated something absolute, and the money was quietly returned. He was not heroic about any of it. He simply noticed what needed to be done and did it. Christmas of 1878 arrived in Harlan Creek with a light dusting of snow that made the whole town briefly beautiful and then turned to brown slush by afternoon. Gertrude decorated the parlor with a few pine boughs and some ribbon, and there was a gathering of the whole boarding house that evening, with Delbert Pike sending over a bottle of his better whiskey as a seasonal gesture, and even Sheriff Crane stopped by for an hour, his hat in his hand and his long face briefly relaxed. Alma made a honey cake that she had learned from her grandmother, a woman who had been dead for 9 years and who had smelled of wood smoke and lavender, and when she carried it out to the table, the room went quiet in the way it did when she produced something extraordinary, and she felt, for a moment, painfully and wonderfully visible. Homer took a piece of the cake and said, "This is the finest thing I have eaten since I came to Colorado." "You have lived in Colorado for 7 years, she said. "I know," he said. She laughed, and it surprised her, the sound of it, a little rusty from disuse. He smiled then, a real one that reached those steady dark eyes, and she thought that she was in a certain amount of trouble, and not the kind she was used to dealing with. January brought the worst of the winter, and with it, a problem at the Rafter A that required Homer to stay out at the ranch for 2 weeks straight, dealing with a section of the herd that had been pushed into rough terrain by a particularly brutal storm and needed to be found and brought back. When he returned to the boarding house on a Sunday evening in late January, he was thinner in the face and moved with the careful economy of a man who was very tired. And Alma, who had not known she was paying attention to his absence until he walked through the door, felt something settle in her chest like a bird landing. She had kept a plate of supper warm without intending to make a point of it, and she brought it out and set it in front of him without ceremony, and he ate it with the expression of a man receiving something he had not expected to deserve. "Thank you," he said. "You looked like you hadn't eaten anything sensible in 2 weeks, she said. "That is accurate," he said. She refilled his coffee and was about to go back to the kitchen when he said, quietly, "I heard those men came back through." She went still. They passed through Pueblo, asked about a woman traveling alone heading south. She set the coffee pot down on the table and looked at it. "They have a name," Homer said. "They're saying it's a legal matter, a man by the name of Whitmore." She said nothing. "Alma," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was different than when anyone else said it. "You don't have to tell me anything, but I need to know if you are safe." She looked at him then directly, and the habit of years pressed at her to deflect and minimize and give him the carefully constructed version of the truth. But there was something in the way he was looking at her, that unhurried, open patience, like a man with all the time in the world, that made the constructed version feel impossibly heavy. "Doyle Whitmore was my husband," she said, "for 3 years. Homer's expression did not change, but she felt him absorb this with his whole body, the way a strong wall absorbs wind. "I left him in the spring of 1876, she said. "He says I took something of his. I did. I took myself." There was a silence in which the fire in the wood stove spoke softly and the wind pushed lightly at the windows. "He has been looking since then," Homer said. "He is not a man who accepts that things leave him," she said. Homer wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment, and she waited for the question that would naturally follow. "Why did you leave? What did he do? Show me your scars," because people always wanted to know, always wanted the full dark inventory of it, wanted to witness the worst of it so they could locate her properly in the landscape of suffering. He did not ask. He looked up at her and said, "The Rafter A has a good guest room. It's a separate building, used to be a bunkhouse. One room, wood stove, good lock on the door. If those men come back through asking specific questions, this town is small enough that somebody is going to tell them something eventually, even without meaning to. You'd be harder to find 6 miles out on a cattle ranch." She stared at him. "I'm not trying to complicate your situation," he said. "Toby is out there full time and he's a decent man. Gertrude could tell people you went on to Pueblo. I am simply saying that if you want it, there is a place." "Why would you do that?" she said. He considered this for a moment, as if checking the answer for accuracy before giving it. "Because you kept my supper warm," he said, "and because a person ought to have somewhere safe to be." She looked at him for a long time. He waited. "I am not a woman who accepts charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "I could use someone who can cook, who doesn't make everything taste like leather. Toby boils things and calls it supper." She recognized that phrase with a start. Those were almost the exact words she had said to Gertrude the day she arrived. He had not been in the room for that conversation. He was simply a man who understood the same things. "I would pay you proper wages," he added. "Same as Gertrude pays or better." She considered it for 3 full days, turning it over in her mind the way you work a stone smooth, examining every angle of it for deception or complication. She watched him those 3 days, and he went about his business without pressing her or even visibly wondering what she would decide, which was itself a kind of answer. She told Gertrude on a Thursday morning. Gertrude looked at her over her coffee mug for a long moment. "Homer Atkins is a good man," Gertrude said. "I have known him 4 years, and I have never known him to be anything else, but good men can be wrong for a person." "I know that," Alma said. "And you know your own business," Gertrude said. "I'll tell people you went to Pueblo if they ask, and if you need to come back here, your room will be empty for a month before I rent it out." Alma thanked her, and Gertrude patted her hand once briefly, and that was that. She moved out to the Rafter A on a Friday in early February 1879, her few belongings in a canvas bag across her saddle, following Homer's big gray horse down a road that cut through snow-dusted scrub brush and red rock, with the morning light coming in low and golden from the east. She watched the land open up around her as they rode, the vast and unsentimental beauty of the Colorado Basin, and thought that she had passed through this kind of country before, always moving through it, and now she was arriving. The Rafter A was larger than she had imagined. The main house was a solid timber and adobe structure, properly built, with a covered porch running the length of the front and real glass in the windows. There was a bunkhouse that served as Toby's quarters, the separate small building that Homer had described for her, a large, well-built barn, and several corrals where horses moved in the cold morning light like dark signatures on white paper. The small bunkhouse that was to be her room was clean, with a good wood stove, a real bed with a thick quilt, a washstand, and a window that looked east toward the mountains. There was a new lock on the door, recently installed. She could tell by the clean, bright metal of it, and she ran her finger over it without saying anything. Homer showed her the kitchen in the main house, a large practical space with a good stove, proper shelves, and a larder that was well stocked because he was a man who planned ahead. He told her she would have full use of the kitchen, and that meals for himself and Toby were what he was hoping for. 3 times a day on working days, twice on Sundays, and anything else she thought needed doing around the house. He showed her around without awkwardness, as if this arrangement were the most natural thing in the world, and then he put on his hat and said he had fencing to see to and left her to make herself at home. Toby Marsh turned out to be exactly as described. A young man of about 20 with sandy hair and a habit of looking at his boots when he talked, hardworking and honest and entirely without guile. He ate whatever she put in front of him with the sincere gratitude of a person who had been surviving on his own cooking for too long, and after the first week, he started leaving small wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill when he found them, which was his version of a thank you. The Rafter A had a rhythm that she fell into with surprising ease. The early mornings, the smell of coffee and horses and cold air, the big wide days of work, the evenings that settled into the particular quiet of a place far from town. She cooked and she cleaned and she mended, and she organized the larder with a thoroughness that Homer clearly appreciated, because he kept finding things in places he had always meant to put them. She learned the names of the horses. There were 9 of them, working horses and a small breeding herd, and began to leave carrots on the top rail of the corral fence in the mornings. And within a week the horses were watching for her with their long, beautiful faces turned toward the house. She and Homer did not have many conversations in those first weeks, at least not in the obvious sense. They had the conversations that work creates. She would ask where he wanted the mended bridle hung. He would ask if there was anything she needed from town on his supply run. She would tell him the woodpile by the house was getting low, and he would have it restocked before the next morning. But they were in the same spaces often, the kitchen in the early morning while coffee boiled, the porch in the evenings when the day had released them, and in those spaces they began to talk in the unhurried way of people with nowhere to be. She learned that he had a younger brother back in Tennessee who wrote letters that Homer answered carefully and at length. She learned that he had come west not because of romantic adventure, but because the land in Tennessee was played out after the war, and a man with nothing needed to go somewhere that was nothing yet, where nothing was still possible. She learned that he had a particular feeling about horses, that he considered them to be among the most honest things in the world because they could not pretend. They showed you exactly what they felt, and you always knew where you stood. People pretend, she said, one evening on the porch where they had fallen into the habit of sitting after supper when the weather allowed. Sometimes they have good reasons, he said. She thought about that for a while. The sky over the mountains had gone the deep indigo that happened right after sunset with the first stars pressing through. I was not always honest, she said. I know that, he said, without any judgment in it at all, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact. It is a hard habit to break, she said. I imagine, he said, but you seem like you're working on it. She looked at him. A person who wasn't working on it wouldn't have said that just now, he said. He got up and went inside then, easy and unhurried as always, and she sat on the porch alone in the dark for a little while and felt the truth of what he had said resting in her chest like warmth. March came in with mud and noise, the snow melting, the creek running high, the cattle restless, and more work on the ranch than any 3 people could properly manage. Homer hired 2 additional hands for the season, brothers named Cal and Emery Briggs from up near Salida, taciturn men who worked hard and asked nothing of anyone, and the Rafter A went into the full sprint of spring cattle work. Alma found herself working harder than she had worked in years, cooking for 5, managing a household that was suddenly a working station for 5 people, and she discovered that she did not mind it. The exhaustion was clean and earned and left no room for the kind of thinking that used to keep her awake in the dark. She began to sleep through the night, which had not been reliably true of her for 3 years. One afternoon in late March, Homer came in from the corrals with a gash on his forearm from a piece of broken fence wire, bleeding in a serious enough way that she sat him down at the kitchen table and cleaned and bound it with the efficiency of someone who had learned field medicine the hard way, and he sat still and let her work. "You've done this before," he said, watching her hands. "I have," she said. She tied off the bandage and pressed it to check the hold. "Thank you," he said. He did not move his arm away immediately, and her hand was still on his wrist, and they were both aware of that for a moment, the warmth of skin, the proximity, and then she stepped back and began cleaning up the basin. "It needs to stay clean," she said. "Change the bandage tomorrow morning." "All right," he said. She went to put the basin away, and she could feel him still sitting there, and she thought that this was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. Not running, not hiding, but this standing still in a place that felt like it could matter. In April, a letter arrived at the Harlan Creek post for Homer, which Toby brought out from town along with the supply run. Homer read it at the supper table, his expression settling into something careful, and then he folded it and set it beside his coffee cup. "My brother is thinking of coming west," he said to no one in particular, though Alma was the only other person in the kitchen that evening. "You'd want that," she said. "James is a good man," Homer said. "A little unsteady on his feet still after the years he's had, but good underneath it." He picked up the letter again, turned it over in his hands. "He'd need work, and somewhere decent to sleep." "There is the other bunkhouse," she said. "There is," Homer said. He was quiet for a moment. "He might be a lot of company," Homer said. "James talks more than I do." "Most people talk more than you do," she said. He looked at her with that almost smile that she had come to watch for. "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said, and found that she meant it completely. She began to understand something about Homer Atkins in April, which was that his silence was not the silence of a person with nothing to say, but the silence of a person who said only what was real. Every sentence he produced was solid because it had been inspected before leaving him, and this meant that, when he said something that mattered, it landed with full weight. He said one of those things on an afternoon in mid-April, when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow-green and the air smelled like water and new grass, and she was hanging laundry on the line strung between the main house and the small building, and he came riding in from the east pasture and swung off his horse at the corral, and then, instead of going directly to the barn, came and stood at a comfortable distance and watched her work for a moment. "You're happy here," he said. It was not entirely a statement and not entirely a question. She held a wet shirt in both hands and thought about honesty and its costs. "I think I might be," she said. "I'm glad," he said. He took his horse to the barn. She finished hanging the laundry, and something she had been carrying very carefully for a long time set itself down. The trouble, when it came back, came harder. On a Saturday in early May, Toby came back from his day off in Harlan Creek with a tightness around his eyes that meant news. He found Homer in the barn and spoke to him quietly, and Homer came to find Alma in the kitchen where she was making bread, and he stood in the doorway with his hat off. "Toby heard something in town," he said. She set down the bread she was shaping. "3 men," he said. "Different ones this time, asking more specific questions, not just a woman traveling alone. They had your name." The kitchen was very quiet. "They have your name," he said again gently because she had not visibly registered it, "and they are saying it's a warrant for theft, that you took money from a Doyle Whitmore of Kansas City, Missouri, and that there is a legal instrument involved." "There is no legal instrument," she said flatly. "He cannot get a warrant for leaving a marriage, and I took nothing from him but what was mine." "I believe you," Homer said. He said it so simply and completely that she felt it like a physical thing. "He has money," she said. "He always had money. He had enough money to make paperwork say whatever he wanted it to say." Homer nodded. He turned his hat in his hands once. "Sheriff Crane is a fair man," he said. "But if someone shows him a warrant from Missouri, he may not have much choice about what he does with it." She felt the old machinery engage inside her, the part that calculated distances and speeds and survival, the part that had kept her alive and moving for 3 years. Her eyes moved to the door behind him, measuring it. "Alma," he said. She looked at him. "I am not going to let that happen," he said. Not with drama, not with the performance of a man making a promise bigger than himself. Simply, quietly, the way he said everything real. "But I need you to stay, I need you not to run." She stared at him. "Running will make you look guilty to Crane and guilty to anyone else watching. Standing your ground is the only thing that works when someone comes at you with paper." "You do not know what he is capable of," she said. "No," Homer said, "but I know what I am capable of. And I know this territory and these people. Let me help you." The word "help" from him did not sound the way it had sounded from other people. From other people it had sounded like trade, or like presumption, or like the setup for a debt. From Homer it sounded simply true. She sat down on the kitchen stool and put her flour-dusted hands in her lap. "Tell me what you want to do," she said. The next week was the most careful of her life in Harlan Creek. Homer rode into town and had a long conversation with Sheriff Crane, not about Alma specifically, but about the general question of warrants from other jurisdictions and how they were handled in Colorado Territory in 1879, and what the process was for contesting a spurious legal claim. He came back with enough information to shape a strategy, and he sat down with Alma at the kitchen table that evening and laid it out as plainly as a fence line. "There is a circuit judge named Harlow who comes through this part of the territory every 2 months, Homer said. "He was here in March, which means he won't be back until May. If those men are working with a proper warrant, which I doubt, they would still need to present it to Crane, who would need to hold you until Harlow arrived to hear it. During that time, you would be able to speak in your own behalf. You are not without rights. Rights have a habit of disappearing when the person on the other side has money," she said. "In some courts," Homer said. "Harlow is a different kind of man. I have seen him work. He doesn't bend for money." He paused. "There is also the matter of what exactly happened in that marriage that might be relevant to a court." Alma looked at the table. "I know you haven't said it," Homer said quietly, "and I am not asking you to say it to me. But if it comes to a hearing, what you can establish about the nature of that marriage may be what saves you." She was quiet for a long time. The fire in the wood stove was the only sound. "He was not kind," she said finally. "That is the summary of it." "I understand," Homer said. He did not push for more. "I have the scar on my hand," she said. "I have others that don't show." "That is evidence," Homer said. "A judge who is worth his position will hear it." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him. "You have done a great deal of thinking about this." "I have been thinking about little else for a week," he said without any self-consciousness about the admission. "Why?" she said, and she meant it as a real question, not a challenge. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you matter," he said. "Because you are a person who deserves to not be hunted by a man she already escaped once. And because—" He stopped, considered what he was about to say with the same seriousness he gave everything. "Because I would like very much for you to still be here, after all of this is settled." She had heard declarations before. She had heard them made in grand gestures and extravagant words by a man who had turned out to use love as a mechanism of ownership. What Homer said was nothing like a declaration. It was a quiet, exact statement of what was true, and it was the most devastating thing anyone had ever said to her. She reached across the kitchen table and put her scarred hand on top of his large, work-calloused one. He turned his hand over and held hers, carefully, as if she had given him something valuable to carry. They sat like that for a few minutes, not saying anything, and the fire spoke quietly in the stove. The men came to Harlan Creek on the 14th of May. There were 3 of them again, 2 hired men and Doyle Whitmore himself, and he had a paper with a proper seal on it from the state of Missouri that he presented to Sheriff Crane with the air of a man who expected immediate compliance. Crane was a thin, careful man who read everything twice before he acted on it, and he read that paper twice, and then said he would need to verify some things before he moved on it. And Whitmore's face went tight, and ugly in the way small-eyed men's faces went tight, and ugly when their authority was questioned. Homer had ridden into town that morning with Alma, not because she asked him to, but because he had simply appeared at the corral gate that morning already saddled and said, I thought I would come in with you today." She had looked at him. "You're not a subtle man," she said. "I'm a direct man," he said. "That's different." They rode into town side by side. Crane met them outside his office and spoke privately with Alma for a long time, with Homer standing on the porch at a proper distance, his back to the wall, watching the street with the patient watchfulness of a man who had decided how things were going to go. Whitmore and his men were at the saloon across the street. Alma could see the shape of Whitmore through the window, the heavy chest, the suit coat. She told Crane clearly and without embellishment what she needed him to know. She told him about the marriage, about why she had left, about what she had taken and what she had not taken. She showed him the scar on her hand, explained how it came to be. She told him that the accusation of theft was a fabrication by a man whose pride could not accept that a woman had left him. Crane listened with the expression of a man performing careful internal calculations. "The warrant is irregular," he said finally. "A Colorado judge would need to validate it before I can act on it, and Judge Harlow is due in 2 weeks. Until then, I am not legally obliged to detain you," she exhaled. "But," Crane said, "Whitmore knows that. He may try to pressure the situation before Harlow arrives." Homer from the porch said quietly, "He won't." Both Crane and Alma looked at him. He had not moved from his position against the wall, but there was something in the way he was looking at the saloon across the street, calm and absolute, that communicated something beyond negotiation. Crane looked at Homer for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have a word with those men about the terms of their stay in my jurisdiction." What Crane said to Whitmore and his men, Alma did not hear directly. What she observed was that afterward Whitmore's face was a dark and furious color, and his men looked at the ground, and they rode out of Harlan Creek by late afternoon. He was not finished, she knew that. A man like Whitmore was never finished by one setback, but he was gone for now. Homer did not speak much on the ride back to the Rafter A when they arrived. He unsaddled both horses and put them up while she went inside and stood in the kitchen and felt the shaking arrive, belatedly, the way the body allows itself to react to things only after they are technically past. She gripped the edge of the counter and breathed. He came in from the barn and found her there. He did not say anything. He put the kettle on the stove and made her tea, which was a thing she had not known he knew how to do, and he set it in front of her and sat down across the table. "It's not done," she said. "I know," he said. "He'll come back around it some other way. He'll find a way." "Maybe," Homer said, "but he's had 3 years at it and you're still here." He looked at her steadily. "You've been fighting this alone for 3 years. You are not fighting it alone anymore." She picked up the tea and held it in both hands the way he held his coffee. "I need to tell you the rest of it," she said. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." He waited. She told him. Not everything, because some things live in a person's body and resist language, but she told him the substance of it. The marriage she had entered at 22, trusting the wrong face. The 3 years of a man who used his size and his temper and his money as instruments of authority over another person. The way she had learned to be invisible inside her own life, to compress herself into the smallest possible shape, to anticipate and accommodate and perform contentment until she looked back from the inside of it and could not find herself at all. She told him about the morning in March of 1876 when she had understood, with the absolute clarity that sometimes arrives after a long fog, that she was going to either die in that house or leave it. She had taken $30 from a household account that she had managed and maintained for 3 years, which by any honest accounting was rightfully as much hers as his, and she had walked out of a house in Kansas City at 4 in the morning with a single bag and her grandmother's recipe for honey cake folded into her coat pocket. Homer sat across the table from her and listened without interrupting and without the expressions that people sometimes made, the ones that were really about themselves and their discomfort with the weight of what they were hearing. He simply received it, all of it, without flinching, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You are a remarkable woman," he said. "I'm a woman who survived," she said. "Those are the same thing from where I sit," he said. She looked at him across the table and felt something break open inside her that was not painful, or not only painful, more like the ice on a river in early spring, the particular violence of thaw, the world moving again after stillness. "Homer," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would like to stay here," she said. "Not just until this is settled." I mean, she stopped, because the habit of not finishing sentences that exposed her was deep. She made herself finish it. "I mean, I would like to stay." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down so that he was at her eye level, and he took her scarred hand in both of his. "I would like that very much," he said. "I have been hoping you might decide that since about December." She laughed, and he smiled, and he very carefully put one hand against her face, just his palm against her cheek, and she leaned into it the way the horses leaned into a kind touch, and she thought that this was what it felt like to stop running. Judge Harlow arrived in Harlan Creek on the 28th of May, a compact, energetic man of about 60, with a white beard and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He heard Alma's account of her marriage, Doyle Whitmore's documentation, and the testimony of Crane about the nature of the warrant and its irregularities. Whitmore arrived for the hearing with a lawyer he had brought up from Pueblo, which told Alma everything about how seriously he was taking it, and that knowledge frightened her. But Homer was there. He sat in the row behind her in the small room that served as Crane's office and hearing space, and he did not reach forward or make any demonstrative gesture, but she could feel him there with the solidity of a wall between her and the wind. Judge Harlow asked his questions precisely and without warmth or sympathy, just the exact questions, and he listened to the answers with the same precision. He asked to see the warrant and examined it for a long time. He asked Whitmore's lawyer to explain the specific statute under Missouri law that governed the theft claim. The lawyer did so, and Harlow asked 3 follow-up questions that made the lawyer go very quiet. Then Harlow looked at Alma over his slipping spectacles and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Sullivan," she said. He paused. Then he said, "Miss Sullivan, the warrant presented here is for theft of $40. You have testified that you took $30 from a household account that you managed. Is that accurate?" "Yes," she said. "The differential does not inspire confidence in the document's accuracy," Harlow said. He looked at Whitmore with the expression of a man who had seen many things and was not impressed by most of them. "This court finds the warrant procedurally irregular and the underlying claim without sufficient merit to compel action by Colorado authorities. The claim is dismissed. Miss Sullivan is free to go where she chooses." He took off his spectacles, cleaned them, put them back on. "I would also note for the record that the evidence presented about the nature of this marriage is deeply troubling, and I intend to make a report to the relevant Missouri circuit regarding the character of the complainant." It was over. She sat in the chair and could not for a moment move. Homer was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just there. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go home." She said nothing to Whitmore as they passed. She did not look at him. There was nothing she needed from that direction anymore, not even the satisfaction of his expression. She walked out of that office and into the May sunshine of Harlan Creek, and stood on the boardwalk with her face tipped up to the warmth, and felt something unlock in her chest that had been locked since 1876. Whitmore left Colorado Territory the following week. He did not ride back out to the Rafter A, and he did not appear on any street in Harlan Creek, and the 2 hired men he had brought were last seen heading south toward New Mexico. Crane sent a brief note to the Rafter A confirming it. Alma read the note at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and set it in the wood stove and watched it turn to ash. June on the Rafter A was expansive and golden and smelled of wild sage and horse and the particular sweetness of high country summer. The grass in the east pasture came up tall, and the cattle were fat in content, and Homer's brother James arrived from Tennessee on the 1st of June, stepping off a horse he had borrowed in Pueblo with a grin and a river of conversation that did not stop for approximately 3 days. James Atkins was 28, dark-haired like his brother but with more of their mother's lightness in him, easier to laugh, quicker to speak, more transparent in his feelings. He took to Alma immediately and without any awkwardness, simply treating her as a person who was there and who mattered to his brother, which made him a person who deserved honest conversation, and she found herself talking to him with an ease that surprised her. He settled into the empty bunkhouse and took to the ranch work with enthusiasm, and Homer, who had been managing with only Toby and the seasonal hands, visibly relaxed in a way that Alma recognized as a man who had been holding a lot alone, finally having some of the weight shared. The Cal and Emery Briggs, the seasonal hands, moved on in mid-June as planned, having completed their contract, and the ranch settled into its summer rhythm with Homer, Toby, and James working the cattle and the fencing and the irrigation, and Alma running the house and the kitchen with a confidence that had been building since February. One evening in late June, Homer asked her to walk with him, and they went east from the ranch toward the rise where the land broke open into a view of the valley below, the creek catching the last light, the mountains to the west going the color of old garnets in the dusk. They stood there for a while, just looking at it. "I have been thinking about asking you something," he said. "All right," she said. "And I want to say it properly," he said. "So I am going to take a minute." She waited, which she had gotten very good at, the waiting that trusted. "I have been a man who was mostly alone for 7 years," he said. "Not unhappy about it exactly, but alone in the way that seems normal when you've done it long enough. And then you came here and this place started to feel different, not just better fed." He paused, and she could see him choosing each word. "Like the difference between a house and a home. I don't say that to put pressure on you or to call in some kind of account for anything I've done. I say it because I think you should know what this has been like from where I am standing." She stood beside him in the long summer dusk and listened to every word. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for a while, and I have been trying to find the right time, and I think I have been waiting too long because I was afraid of frightening you. And I decided tonight that being afraid of the right thing was no way to be a man who respects himself." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley, giving her room, not pressing his face into her space. "Homer," she said. He turned. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to be careful about it because I did not trust myself, and I did not know how to trust another person, and I have been—" She stopped. "I have been very slow." "You have been exactly the right speed," he said. She laughed, and then she stepped forward and he put his arms around her, carefully and then with certainty. And she put her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was steady and even and real, and thought that the whole long, terrible journey of the last 3 years had arrived, finally, at something worth arriving at. He kissed her that evening on that ridge, with the mountains turning dark behind them and the first stars appearing and the smell of sage on the warm air. And it was nothing like she expected, and exactly what she wanted, unhurried, honest, certain. July brought the heat and the work of it, and August brought a neighbor's crisis that drew everyone on the Rafter A into the community effort of helping the Delaney spread to the south manage a fence fire that took out 2 miles of property line before it was contained. The ranchers of the valley worked together for 3 days straight to restring the fence and settle the Delaney's frightened cattle, and Alma spent those 3 days in the Delaney kitchen, helping Margaret Delaney feed a rotating crew of 15 men, and it was the first time she had felt part of something larger than her own survival in longer than she could clearly remember. Margaret Delaney was a round, warm woman of about 45 who talked with her hands and laughed easily, and who, on the second evening when they were alone cleaning up after the crew, said to Alma, "Homer Atkins has been a bachelor so long that half the women in the county had given up on him." "Is that so?" Alma said. "The other half were waiting," Margaret said, and gave Alma a look of cheerful knowing. "He is not an easy man to give up on," Alma said. "No," Margaret agreed. "He is not." She handed Alma a clean dish. "You are good for him. A person can see it from 20 feet." Alma took the dish and dried it carefully. "He is very good for me," she said, and felt the simple truth of it like sunlight. In September, Homer asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He asked her one morning at the kitchen table while she was making biscuits, because he had learned that asking things while she was doing something with her hands was when she was most herself, least defended, most present. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band that he set on the table beside the biscuit dough, and he said, "I'd like to marry you, Alma Sullivan, if you're willing. I am a man with a ranch and a difficult brother and 9 horses and no talent for baking, and I would like to build a life with you if you'll have me." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She picked up the ring and looked at it more closely, and then she put it on her right hand because her left was covered in biscuit dough, and she looked at it there, this small, ordinary, perfect thing. "Yes," she said, "I am entirely willing." He smiled, that full, real smile that still made her feel like she had accomplished something. "Right," he said, "I'll finish the biscuits." "You cannot make biscuits," she said. "I cannot," he said, "but I could try." "Absolutely not," she said, and moved back to the dough, and he sat back at the table and watched her with an expression she had no name for except love. They were married in October of 1879, in the small white church in Harlan Creek with its cracked bell that did not ring, in a ceremony conducted by the local pastor and attended by Gertrude Fowler, who wore her best dress and cried with the unsentimental efficiency of a woman who never wasted anything, including tears. James Atkins stood up for his brother with a speech afterward at Gertrude's dining room that was too long and very funny, and made everyone present feel like they had just finished an excellent meal. Toby Marsh, who had come into town for the occasion, sat in the pew with the expression of a man who is genuinely happy about something and is slightly startled by how strong the feeling is. Sheriff Crane came and brought a sensible gift of preserved foods. The Delaney family came and brought a quilt that Margaret had been secretly making since August, pieced together in a pattern she called wedding ring, which made Alma run her fingers over the stitching for a long time in silence. The night of the wedding, when the celebration at Gertrude's had wound down and Homer and Alma rode back to the Rafter A together under a sky absolutely crowded with stars, she thought about the night she had ridden into this town with $37 in her coat hem and a derringer in her boot, and a name she was practicing forgetting. She had not forgotten her name. She had not needed to. She was Alma Sullivan, and now she would be Alma Atkins, and both of those names were hers, all of her, nothing compressed or hidden, and the man riding beside her knew more of her truth than anyone alive and had chosen her anyway, had stood in the path of everything that wanted to push her away and had simply held his ground. She reached across in the darkness and found his hand, and he laced his fingers through hers without looking, the way a person touches something they know exactly. "What are you thinking?" He said, "That I am glad I rode into Harlan Creek," she said. "So am I," he said, "every day." Winter came to the Rafter A with the solemnity that winter had in that part of Colorado, and the house that had been a house became something else, full of light and conversation, and the smell of Alma's cooking and Homer's quiet presence, and James's inexhaustible talk and Toby's careful silences, and the sound of 9 horses in the barn at night, shuffling and breathing in the cold. Alma began teaching James to cook in December, because she could see that he was a man who would need to feed himself eventually and currently could not. And James turned out to be an apt and enthusiastic student who made everything taste slightly too sweet because he believed in a more optimistic application of sugar than was strictly necessary. This became a small recurring comedy in the household that never got old. Homer and Alma moved her few things from the small bunkhouse into the main house after the wedding, and she found that the room that had been his alone for 7 years made space for her without any friction, as if it had been waiting. She put her grandmother's recipe card for honey cake in the kitchen drawer, pressed flat under a cutting board, and every time she made the cake after that, she felt the woman who had taught it to her standing somewhere just at the edge of the room. In the spring of 1880, Alma learned she was going to have a child. She told Homer on a Tuesday evening, no particular occasion, simply told him the fact as he was cleaning a bridle at the kitchen table, because she had come to believe that important things were best delivered plainly. He set down the bridle and looked at her, and she watched something move across his face that was beyond expression, joy and seriousness and wonder combined, and also a tenderness so complete it made the room feel like something sacred. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I am very well," she said. He stood up and came to her and held her with the same careful certainty of the first time, and she felt him breathe deep and slow with his face in her hair. "A child," he said softly. "A child," she said. James, when told, reacted with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting to be an uncle his entire life, immediately proposing names that were rejected, offering to expand the house to accommodate a growing family, and producing from somewhere a worn copy of a book about child rearing that he had apparently been carrying in his saddle bag since Tennessee. Where he had acquired it, and why he had been carrying it were questions he never adequately answered. Alma carried the pregnancy through the Colorado summer with the pragmatic good health of a woman who had never had the luxury of being delicate, and the rafter A moved around her as it always had, with the addition of Homer's new and particular watchfulness, not overprotective, not hovering, just more present, finding small ways to reduce her labor without treating her as though she had become a different kind of person. The baby came in December of 1880, a boy with Homer's jaw and Alma's eyes, born in the main house with a midwife named Helen Briggs, no relation to the seasonal hands, who had been delivering babies in the valley for 15 years, and who handled the entire event with the calm authority of a woman for whom this was the most natural thing in the world. They named him Theodore James Atkins. Theodore for no one in particular, because they both liked the sound of it, and James for Homer's brother, who was so moved by the honor that he went red in the face and had to go stand outside in the cold for several minutes to compose himself. Theodore was from his first hours a child of extraordinary opinions, communicating them loudly and without ambiguity, and Alma, who had spent 3 years making herself silent and small, found in her son's furious, voluble presence a kind of answer she had not known she was looking for. She held him in the rocking chair that Homer had made over the course of 2 weeks in October, which was not entirely level but was built with every intention of his heart, and she thought that she had not known, when she rode into Harlan Creek with $37 in her hem, that she was riding toward all of this. James, as predicted, turned out to be an excellent uncle of the most enthusiastic and occasionally exhausting variety, willing to hold the baby at any hour, willing to make any face or sound that produced a smile, willing to read aloud to Theodore at an age when Theodore could not possibly have understood anything being read, but James claimed it didn't matter. Toby Marsh, more quietly, also took to the baby with a sincerity that was purely Toby. He built Theodore a small carved horse out of pine, worked over it for 3 weeks with a penknife, and left it on the kitchen table one morning without any announcement, and Alma found it and recognized it for what it was, and made sure to thank him properly, which turned him red to his ears. The rafter A continued to grow in those years after Theodore's birth. Homer added to the herd, expanded the east pasture, built a proper bunkhouse for the seasonal hands who were no longer occasional but regular. James, who had settled into the valley with the ease of a man who had found his place, proved to be not just good company but a genuinely skilled cattleman with a particular gift for managing difficult horses, and the 2 brothers built the rafter A into the most respected operation in the valley without either of them making much noise about it. Alma ran the household with the competence she had always had, the difference being that now it was her household and her choice, and the distinction was not small. She made bread on Tuesdays and Saturdays. She kept the kitchen accounts and the supply inventory with a precision that Homer called formidable and Toby called frightening and James called thank God, because he had no head for numbers. She began a kitchen garden behind the main house that first spring, and by the second year, it was producing enough vegetables to supplement the larder through winter and to trade with some of the neighboring families. In the spring of 1882, their second child arrived, a girl this time, who they named Clara Rose, because the wild roses along the fence were blooming when she was born, and Alma stood at the window that morning and looked at them, and said the name out loud, and it was immediately right. Clara was quieter than her brother from the start, a serious, watchful child who looked at everything with her father's patience and her mother's measuring attention, and who from very early showed a particular affinity for the horses, wanting to be carried out to the corral before she could walk, reaching her small hands toward the long, soft noses. Theodore, at 2, accepted his sister with the generosity of a child who has been loved enough to have love to spare, and from very early they were a pair, the loud one and the quiet one, each necessary to the other. Homer and Alma, in those years of building and growing, found between them a partnership that ran deeper than either of them would have known to hope for. They did not agree about everything, and they were both people with opinions, and there were mornings when the air between them had the particular charged quality of two people who had just said something true and difficult. But they had both lived enough to know that the ability to be honest with someone you loved was not a problem. It was the thing itself, the substance of it. She told him once, on a winter evening when Theodore and Clara were asleep, and the house was quiet and they were sitting by the stove with coffee, that she still sometimes dreamed about running. Not nightmares exactly, but that specific feeling of motion, of distance accumulating behind her. He did not tell her that the running was over, which would have been a kind of dismissal. He said, "What does it feel like when you wake up?" She thought about it. "Like I got to choose to stay," she said. "That's a good feeling," he said. "It is," she said. "It's the best feeling I know." He reached across and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face with one finger, the gesture of a man who was entirely at home with this person, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and the fire in the stove kept its quiet counsel. Gertrude Fowler came to visit the rafter every spring, a tradition she had instituted in 1880, and which no one questioned because Gertrude was not a person you questioned. She would arrive on a Saturday morning with a gift of something practical and immediately begin an inspection of the kitchen and household that she performed without any apology, and which Alma met without any apology of her own, because she knew it was Gertrude's version of love, checking and verifying and confirming that the person she had hired off the street and taken a chance on was genuinely well. In 1882, Gertrude stood in the rafter kitchen doorway and looked at the garden through the window and the pot of venison stew on the stove and the two children playing on the kitchen floor and Homer's hat on the hook by the door, and she said, "Well, well," Alma agreed. "This is a good life," Gertrude said. "Yes," Alma said, "it is." "You built it," Gertrude said. "We built it," Alma said. Gertrude drank her coffee and looked at the garden and said no more about it, and the subject was closed and complete. In the summer of 1883, James Atkins met a woman named Prudence Hartley at the Harlan Creek 4th of July gathering, a schoolteacher who had come from Ohio to take the Valley's small school position, and who turned out to be a woman of great intelligence and very limited patience for excessive talking, which meant she was precisely suited to James in a way that suggested the universe had a sense of humor. She told him on their third meeting that he needed to learn to pause occasionally, and he said, laughing, that he had been told this before and had failed to implement the advice, and she said she would take it as a personal project, and by October they were engaged. Prudence and Alma liked each other immediately, the way two women sometimes do when they have both arrived somewhere difficult and come through it with their essential selves intact. Prudence had come west by choice, not by flight, but she understood self-determination in the way of a woman who had built her life against expectation. And they had that in common in a way that made conversation easy and friendship natural. James and Prudence were married the following spring, in the same small white church in Harlan Creek, and Homer stood up for James this time with a speech that was short, precise, and said everything that needed to be said in about 4 sentences, which James claimed was an act of brotherly aggression, but which Prudence said was the finest wedding speech she had ever heard. Prudence moved into the original main house bunkhouse, which Homer converted into proper living quarters for the newlyweds, and James came in from the field at midday now with a different quality of purpose. And Alma watched him and thought that people finding their right place in the world was one of the most quietly spectacular things. By 1884, the Rafter A had become what Homer had, in those early years, only half dared to imagine: a proper establishment, producing enough cattle annually to ship north to the rail line at Pueblo, maintaining a herd of working horses that were beginning to attract buyers from across the territory, and housing 3 full-time hands in addition to the family. The name Atkins had weight in that valley in the way that honest work accumulated weight, slow and certain. Alma was 32 years old that autumn, and she stood one October morning on the porch of the main house in the same hour of the same quality of morning light that had been falling over this ranch every October since she arrived, and she thought about who she had been when she rode into Harlan Creek and who she was now. Not that she was unrecognizable to herself, the essential Alma Sullivan who could cook anything and read a room and calculate an exit was still entirely present, but layered over and through her was everything that had been built since: Homer's constancy, Theodore's loud particular love, Clara's serious eyes, the kitchen garden that came back every year without being told to, the horses who knew her step. The derringer that had lived in her boot for 3 years was in a box in the bedroom now, still loaded because she was a practical woman but not carried. She did not need to carry it. She had become someone who did not need to carry it, which was different from never having needed it at all, and the difference was real and worth naming. Homer came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn, moving in that unhurried way of his, and stopped when he saw her on the porch, the way he had stopped on the day they first met, just for a second. "What are you doing?" he said. "Looking at my life," she said. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her. The October morning lay itself open in front of them, the high desert basin going copper and gold, the mountains in the distance wearing the first white of the season. "What do you see?" he said. "Everything I want," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood there for a while in the morning light, watching the land that was theirs. Theodore came running around the corner of the house. A moment later, at full speed, with a wooden horse James had carved him raised above his head, shouting something about an Indian raid that was audible from some distance, and Clara came behind him at her precise and dignified toddle, completely unbothered by her brother's battle. And Homer reached down and picked Clara up with one arm without breaking stride, and she settled against his shoulder with the complete confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt that arms will be there when needed. "Breakfast," Alma said. "Breakfast," Homer agreed, and they went inside. The years turned the way years did in that country, with the seasons marking them in colors and temperatures rather than numbers, and the Rafter A grew with each of them. Toby Marsh, who at 22 had been the youngest fixed point of the operation, turned 25 and fell in love with a girl from the Delaney spread, a young woman named Irene who had red hair and a direct way of saying things that Alma recognized and liked immediately, and she told Homer that she had a feeling about it, and Homer said he did too. Toby and Irene married in 1885 and built their own small house on the western edge of the Rafter A property, and Toby continued to work the ranch with a new domestic happiness that expressed itself mostly in the extreme care he now took of his workhorse, which he had named Duke, and which ate better than most humans. James and Prudence had their first child in 1886, a boy they named Henry, who arrived squalling and red-faced into James's enormous enthusiasm and Prudence's precise and capable arms, and who, from his first weeks, looked around the world with the expression of someone who expected things to be interesting and was prepared to work on that assumption. Theodore started school in Harlan Creek, the year Prudence opened the new schoolhouse that the county had finally funded, and because Prudence was his aunt, this was a situation of such complex potential that both Homer and Alma spent some time thinking carefully about it. But Prudence was a professional in the schoolroom in a way that had nothing to do with family, and Theodore responded to her authority with more respect than he gave most people, possibly because he sensed that she was exactly as direct as his mother and twice as unimpressed by nonsense. Clara, 2 years behind her brother, turned out at school to be a child of such focused intelligence that Prudence told Alma privately that she was the best student she had taught in her years of teaching, which was information Alma received without surprise, but with a specific quality of quiet pride that she thought about for days afterward. In 1887, on a spring evening when the creek was running high and the air smelled of water and returning things, Homer sat down with Alma on the porch after supper and told her that he had been thinking about the ranch, about what it might become in the next decade, and whether they should consider buying the Hollies parcel to the north, which had come available after old Silas Hollies had gone to live with his daughter in Denver. They talked about it for 2 hours, the way they talked about everything important, with both of them present and both of them listening, and neither of them in a hurry to have already decided. He had the financial picture mapped clearly in his head, and she had the practical questions that came from knowing what additional land would demand of their time and resources, and together they arrived at an answer that was neither his nor hers but theirs. They bought the Hollies parcel. By autumn it had been folded into the Rafter A with the same working intelligence that had built everything else here, and the ranch became what it would be from then on, one of the largest and most productive cattle operations in that part of Colorado, run by a family that had been built out of nothing in particular except honesty and persistence, and the willingness to stand in place when standing in place was required. There were, over the years, difficulties. There were hard winters and one bad summer drought in 1888 that took a toll on the cattle and required a renegotiation of the financial picture. There was a dispute with a neighbor to the south, resolved eventually through the good offices of Sheriff Crane's successor, a younger man named Garfield who turned out to be nearly as fair. There was a year when Toby's health troubled him and Homer carried extra work without complaint until Toby was back on his feet. There was the grief of losing Gertrude Fowler in the winter of 1889, which arrived the way the loss of fixed things arrives, making the landscape different in a way you could not have predicted but which you recognized, once it was there, as loss. Alma went to the funeral and stood in the cold outside the Crackbell Church and thought about the woman who had hired her off the street on the strength of 2 hands laid on a table, who had told people she'd gone to Pueblo when they asked, and kept her room empty for a month. She thought that survival was almost always a collective enterprise, that you were rarely if ever truly alone in it even when you believed you were, that there were people along every road who made the difference between arrival and not arriving. She said some version of this to Homer that evening, and he said, "Gertrude was a good woman." "She was," Alma said. "She was the first person who looked at me in this town and decided I was worth something." "Second," Homer said. She looked at him. "I looked at you on your second morning here," he said, with absolute straight-faced accuracy. She laughed, and even in the grief of the day the laugh was real, because that was what he did. He did not paper over the difficult things, but he held them in a frame that was larger, that had room for everything. Theodore grew into a young man of formidable energy and strong opinions, who took to cattle work with a natural authority that both pleased and slightly alarmed Homer, who recognized in his son the kind of confidence that needed to be earned properly. He sent Theodore to work a full season on the Delaney spread at 16, not as punishment but as education, the kind that came from working for someone other than your own family. And Theodore came back quieter and more precise, and somewhat more appreciative of what had been built on the rafter A, which was exactly what Homer had intended. Clara grew into a young woman who read everything she could find, who helped Prudence at the schoolhouse from the time she was 12, and who at 16 had made it known, calmly and without drama, that she intended to go to normal school to train as a teacher herself. Alma sat with this information for a day and then said yes, because she understood what it was to know your own mind about your own life, and the understanding was personal and absolute. In the autumn of 1892, with Theodore 21 and working the rafter A at his father's right hand, and Clara gone to Denver for her teacher's training, and James and Prudence's family having expanded to 3 children with the arrival of a girl they named Ruth, and Toby and Irene settled comfortably into their years with 2 growing boys, Homer and Alma sat on the porch of the main house on a September evening that had the first cool edge of autumn in it, and the valley below was going gold. And the mountains to the west were doing what they did, that violent purple beauty that had been doing this every evening for longer than any human memory could contain. Alma was 40 years old. Homer was 46. The years had settled onto both of them with the particular dignity that came from having actually lived them, and they were, both of them, more fully themselves than any younger version had been. "I have been thinking," Homer said. "You are always thinking," she said. "What is it this time?" "I have been thinking that I would like to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He turned to look at her, fully, the way he had looked at her that first morning in the boarding house dining room when she had set coffee in front of him, and he had said good morning. "When I was in Tennessee," he said, "and everything there had run out and I decided to come west, I had a particular idea of what I was coming to. Land, work, something to build. I did not have any idea of what else I might find." He paused. "I am a man who does not believe in luck exactly. I believe in work and in showing up, but I believe in you, in what you did by riding into Harlan Creek and staying, in what we have made together." She looked at him, this man who had stood in the way of everything that had come after her, not theatrically, not with any performance of heroism, but with the same plain and absolute intention with which he did every other thing in his life. "I have thought many times," she said, "about what would have happened if I had ridden to a different town." "So have I," he said. "I don't like thinking about it." "I don't either," she said. She reached over and put her hand over his on the arm of the porch chair, and he turned his hand and held hers. "But I did not ride to a different town. I rode here." "You did," he said. "And you were here," she said. "I was," he said. The evening sat around them with all its September beauty, the sky going the colors it went, the land holding its own long history indifferently and magnificently, and the ranch breathing around them, the horses in the barn, the cattle in the east pasture, the light in James and Prudence's window, the sounds of children that carried in the still air. She had been running from a past she never mentioned, and he had never asked, and he had simply stood in the way, not blocking her, never that, but placing himself between her and the worst of what was chasing her, a human bulwark made of quietness and steadiness, and the particular courage of a person who decides that someone else's survival matters. And now she was not running. She was here. She was entirely here, in this body, in this place, in this life that had been built out of 2 people's willingness to trust, and the October honey cakes, and the horses that had learned her step, and the children who slept inside, and the mountains that had been watching all of it with their ancient purple indifference and their terrible beauty. She had $37 and a derringer, and a name she was practicing forgetting the day she rode in. She had everything now, all of it. She would not practice forgetting a single piece of it. Homer squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, and they watched the last of the light leave the mountains and the first stars appear in the deep blue Colorado sky, and the evening settled in around them as it had for 13 years, as it would continue to do, as long as they were here to watch it come.